The second Trump administration is aggressively pursuing the deportation of all immigrants residing in the United States without legal status, a significant departure from immigration policy in recent decades, which prioritized the deportation of undocumented immigrants with criminal records. The social implications of this are far-reaching, as are the impacts on the U.S. labor force and its economy. Last month, I talked with Chloe East, an associate professor of economics at the University of Colorado, Denver, about the impact of Trump's deportation policy on the labor market for the Conversations on Migration series, a monthly virtual series hosted by the Baker Institute Migration Initiative. During our conversation, Chloe, who is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor, explained why, contrary to the myth of the job-stealing immigrant, mass deportations don't actually help U.S.-born workers, and why Trump's proposed deportations will actually come with a significant price tag. If you're interested in learning more about the Conversations on Migration series and joining these talks, you can click the link in the show notes. I'm Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Mexico Centered. Thank you so much for joining us, Chloe.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So let me begin. The thing that we're dealing with today is obviously a number of executive orders from President Donald Trump to deport all undocumented immigrants living in the United States. That's quite a departure from previous presidents who had done more targeted deportations. These deportations are proceeding. We see that there are now worksite raids, people being detained, chained, put in planes, and sent abroad. Of course, is it possible to deport 11 million people? How will that help our economy? One of the major reasons is that President Trump is convinced that they take American jobs that should go to American workers. So the question I think that I want to begin with today is, what do we know about whether deportations will help the U.S. economy and actually open up more jobs for Americans? And will they take these jobs that may be vacated by these deportations?
Yes, I think this is a really important question to understand the motivations behind the current rhetoric and what we would expect to see if Trump is successful in deporting a large number of people, anywhere close to the 11 million, or honestly even less. I think it's important to understand. My research looks at the effects of a previous mass deportation policy that was implemented in the first Obama administration to understand the question of, do we expect to see future mass deportations creating more jobs for US-born workers? And what we see really clearly from my research, which I can dive into in more detail, is that mass deportations are not helpful for US-born workers. And on the whole, they don't create more job opportunities for US-born people. And in fact, they harm job opportunities for US-born people because immigrants are such an important part of the economy that the economy on the whole is hurt when deportations happen, which includes harms to US-born workers.
So we know what mass deportations, we're talking about 11 million folks or so, perhaps more now. They're essential for the economy. We know what deporting them would do to families. Family separation would be one thing because many of them have US-born children. We know what it does to communities that live in fear. This affects their mental health, their well-being in general. But the conversation here is on labor markets. So how do we figure out what the exact effects will be on the labor markets? What do we expect if you pluck all these workers? Most of them are actually working, participating in the labor force. What does that do to our labor market?
Our labor market is so dependent on immigrants, including unauthorized immigrants. They make up a huge part of the labor market as a whole, and in particular in several sectors like manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and the service sector. And so removing a large percentage of the labor force, especially in these really key sectors, is harmful for the labor market and harmful for the economy. And the way that we sort of answer that question is we look at the county by county rollout of this policy that I mentioned called Secure Communities, and we compare the labor market outcomes of foreign-born people and U.S.-born people in counties that implemented secure communities early relative to counties that implemented secure communities later. And in that way, we can sort of separate out the causal effects of deportations on a local area's labor market from any correlations between the presence of immigrants and the economy, because we also know that immigrants are willing and interested in moving to places that are doing well economically. And so we want to separate out that effect from the causal impact of heightening deportations in a local area.
What is a secure community program?
So the Secure Communities program was one of the more targeted or supposedly targeted deportation policies. It increased information sharing between local law enforcement agencies and ICE, so that when somebody was arrested during the booking process in jail, their fingerprints would be automatically sent to ICE once the policy was in place, which was not how things were done before. This policy led to about 400,000 people being deported in the sort of first era of the policy, which was between 2008 and the end of 2013. The policy has been sort of flip-flopped since the end of 2013, depending on who's sitting in the White House. But that's the basic idea of the policy.
So the design of the study was, let's take a county that implemented this earlier and deported its migrants and what it did to them, and then one that did it later. So it allows you a stretch of time to compare those that did it early and those that did it later and say, okay, this is what happened when you essentially deport your undocumented workers in the county.
That's right. And because it was a federal program, there was not a lot of discretion that local areas had in terms of when they implemented the program or how they implemented the program, which is nice for doing that comparison of early versus late counties, because we argue and show evidence for in our research that a county that implemented the policy early is very similar to a county that implemented the policy later. It's just that they were sort of first on the waiting list to be let off by the federal government to implement the policy.
Did you find that any counties perhaps thought twice about implementing such policy after they saw the effects in the counties that implemented that policy and how they lost the immigrant population and therefore a lot of workers?
Absolutely. The big sanctuary city movement in the 2010s was in part in a response to the Secure Communities program. Local law enforcement themselves were saying that the policy was hurting their ability to do their jobs because it took a lot of time, it took a lot of money, and it made the immigrant community distrustful of law enforcement. But also there was this acknowledgement that immigrants are such an important part of local economies that this policy and other deportation policies will hurt the local economy. And so some states and localities did push back towards the end of the period that I mentioned that ends in 2013. And that was partly why the policy ended at the end of 2013, is because of state and local pushback.
So now let me dive a little bit into specific sectors, because I think immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, are not distributed evenly throughout the economy. They concentrate their activity, their economic activity, their work in certain sectors. Obviously, you mentioned some of them: construction, agriculture, food processing, landscaping, roofing, some cleaning services in buildings in big cities, and a number of other industries. If you were to take all these immigrant workers out of these different sectors, can you give us 2 or 3 examples of what they would do? For example, in construction, I can only imagine what that would do to construction. Agriculture, I can only imagine what it would do to agriculture in the United States. What would happen to crops and things like that? Can you break that down for us so that we, as the public, understand that we are kind of playing with fire here?
Yes, I'm happy to. So I'll start with construction because that is such an important one. And the cost of homes is such an important topic right now as well, which is related. So I'll start by saying that 20% of construction workers in the entire US are estimated to be unauthorized immigrants. So this is a huge part of the construction labor force. And so the research done also on secure communities, actually in a sort of complementary paper to the analysis that I've done, focuses specifically on the construction sector and how did the construction sector fare after secure communities came into place. And what they find is that There is a big reduction in the availability of construction laborers when deportations and detentions pick up. And some US born people take the jobs left behind by the deportations and detentions, but not enough are willing to take those, dangerous, low-paying jobs. So construction firms, the employers, are left scrambling trying to find workers to build the homes and office buildings that they're trying to build. And as a result, what the research shows is that the number of new construction permits goes down, and the number of new homes that are built also goes down as a result of deportations and detentions. And then one thing that I think is important to note that is found in the construction sector, but is also found in my research on sort of the economy more broadly, is that not only do US born people not fill in the jobs left behind one-to-one, but when construction firms have a hard time finding construction site laborers that are jobs typically taken by immigrants, they also hire fewer architects and construction site managers, and those are jobs more often taken by US born workers. So not only is there not this sort of substitution effect like we would expect to see, but then there's also this sort of secondary harmful effect on US born workers because just the overall building slows down, and that hurts US born workers. And then final point on construction, and then I'm happy to talk about other examples, is that this research also documents what does this do to the price of new homes and existing homes. And they find that in the long run, deportations and detentions raise the price of housing in a local area because it depresses building of new homes, which is really the main thing we need in order to solve the housing crisis.
Let me delve into one other sector as an example in this conversation. Agriculture. Obviously, we all go to the supermarket, we all pick our tomatoes and our lettuces and our strawberries and things like that. Imagine if all of a sudden all the agricultural workers, which are probably in the millions, from Georgia to California, would suddenly disappear. What would the effect of this be on our food supply, and of course the prices?
Absolutely. So half of crop farm workers in the US are unauthorized immigrants, and that's just thinking about people who pick crops. It's not thinking about people who, drive the tomatoes from the farms to the grocery stores, which are also heavily overrepresented as immigrant workers. So immigrants are super important in supplying the food and produce that we all buy at the grocery store. And what we would expect to see based on that fact and what else we know from the past research is that when there will be increases in deportations, that it will reduce availability of the agricultural workforce, and that's going to lead to shortages of goods at our grocery store and higher prices of food at the grocery store.
The other, I think, economic impact of this, when you section off millions of workers and then take them out of the economy, is that the revenue also suffers, because there is a myth out there that undocumented workers do not pay taxes. So I guess I have a flat question, a very simple question. Do they pay taxes? What taxes do they pay? And if you section them off and take them out of the economy, what will that do to two things? Our budgets, local, state, and federal, and of course, the idea that we are all entitled to Social Security and to certain benefits. Why would that happen if you all of a sudden have many fewer contributors to the resources that obviously we draw our benefits and expect our entitlements from, i.e., when I retire, my Social Security, for example?
Yes, this is a really important myth to dispel. So we know very clearly that unauthorized immigrants pay billions of dollars in taxes at the federal, state, and local level. This includes sales tax, of course, like we all pay when we shop, but also property tax and income tax. In fact, a lot of unauthorized immigrants go out of their way to make sure that they're paying income tax in case that helps them gain legal status later. Additionally, they also pay payroll tax when they're getting paid, as we all do. And the payroll tax in particular, I think, is a good example of what you're talking about in terms of funding entitlement programs. So Our payroll taxes go to funding Social Security and Medicare, among other things. And those are two programs we know are in funding crisis right now, in part because the population is aging in the US and the birth rate is falling. And so in order to keep those programs solvent without majorly cutting benefits, we need to have a large working age population that is paying into Social Security and Medicare funds. And that population now is largely made up of immigrants. So immigrants right now are really helping to keep Social Security and Medicare going. And if we remove immigrants, there will be a big reduction in revenue for those programs, and we will have even more cuts to those programs.
And the thing about that is that they themselves, although they pay in sales tax, payroll tax, income tax, and on, they don't themselves draw from that because they're not entitled to. You have to be a citizen or a permanent resident to draw from it. So it's kind of a net contribution, right?
Yes, that's a really important point. Thanks for clarifying. Yes, that unauthorized immigrants are not eligible for most, if not basically all, federal, state, and local programs, and that includes Social Security and Medicare. So while they are paying in as part of their taxes, they are not eligible to receive benefits later on.
So in exploring the costs of deportations, because this is kind of the gist of the conversation, we're also looking at the major efforts of the Trump administration to reduce the federal government, essentially taking a machete and slashing federal workers here and there. Is there a possibility that there may be enough ICE agents to actually deport 11 million? How reasonable that is? And I guess the question, the more economic question of it is, how much would that cost? Because I guess in some communities are where migrants are heavily concentrated, you can certainly go and pick up 100, 120, 150 of them. But eventually it's going to be like finding a needle in a haystack because they're going to hide, they're going to be very careful, they're not going to go out a whole lot. So it's going to have to be kind of an attrition effort that's going to be very costly. Are there any calculations about how much we taxpayers will have to fork out to pay for these operations, these deportations, not just in what we lose, but also what we have to pay to carry out these operations?
Yes. So I'll start with the second question and then sort of back. So in terms of the cost of deporting roughly 11 million people, the American Immigration Council put out a very comprehensive report last year that was very clear that we do not have the capacity to do that many deportations right now, and that it would be very costly. And they estimate it would cost about $315 billion in order to deport 11 million people. And that is, I think, an underestimate because they're doing their best to factor in lots of different complicated things, but it's really hard to calculate exactly what you're saying, which is that the sort of first set of unauthorized immigrants might be relatively easy to find and identify and deport, but it becomes harder and harder as you increase deportations. So I think we should think of $315 billion as a conservative estimate of the costs. And just to sort of put that into perspective, they also say that that's the same cost as building 3 million new homes in the US, which would actually close the gap that we have right now between population growth and housing growth. So that would have a huge impact on the housing shortage we have right now and the cost of housing as well. So then to turn to sort of the more logistical side of things, that report and other scholars, including myself, are very clear that no, we do not have the capacity right now to do a deportation effort on this scale. We don't have enough ICE officers. We don't have enough detention centers. We don't have enough beds at the detention centers. And we're sort of seeing the consequences of that right now, just in the first month of the Trump administration. You know, we've seen the detention center open up at Guantanamo Bay. We've seen private prisons talking about reopening locations that they had previously closed as detention centers. We also saw the Trump administration try to authorize IRS officers to do immigration enforcement because they just simply don't have enough ICE officers. And so there are real practical constraints to doing a deportation on this scale that we're seeing them try to work around, but I think they're still going to run up against.
And I'm a bit concerned that this may turn out into a deportation industrial complex, if you will. I've already seen a proposal by, I think, Blackwater in which they said, well, if you give us tens of billions of dollars, we'll conduct this operation. You have to deputize citizens to detect and arrest, I guess citizens arrest, whatever that may be, detentions, and then call us. We'll do it. But then that makes it deportation for profit. There's a perversion in that, right? It turns citizens into immigration enforcers. And who can be safe in this environment? I don't know. I have this more sociological/anthropological concern. I'm going off our subject, which is mostly economics, but I'm concerned about that. It can be an industry for profit as well.
Absolutely. I'm concerned about that too. I mean, just on the for-profit side, we are seeing private companies, pitching that if they're given government contracts, they're happy to build more detention centers. And I think it will be useful and informative to sort of track who gets rich off of this increase in deportations in the next few years, because people will, and it will mostly be these private prison companies. So I think that's an important point as well.
Yeah, and that's a cost, obviously, because we have to pay it. And now we have to pay it not as a government activity, but as a profitable activity for companies that are going to essentially seek to make money out of it.
Yes, absolutely.
So another misconception that I think is really important to talk about is I've recently done some review of the literature on immigration, the major debates, and I landed on the idea that under President Bush, President Obama, and President Biden, they kind of focused the law enforcement activities on what they call criminal aliens, defined differently by each administration. But obviously, they focused their enforcement. And in the case of President Obama, obviously trying to leave some of the communities alone as long as there were no criminal issues or domestic violence or criminal activity, but sort of focused on that. The Trump administration has said they're all criminals. Their presence in the United States is criminal, so they all got to go. We know it's more of an administrative violation than a criminal violation, but it doesn't really matter. That is now a distinction without a difference. They're all being labeled criminals. What do we know about this idea that crime costs and that these are all criminals? To what extent are they criminals? And what does it cost to label so many people criminals in our midst for simply the fact that they are here without authorization?
Yes, I think this is a really important point and sort of a discouraging point, as you can probably tell by my reaction. But it's another point that is the rhetoric is not attached to the facts. So to give you the facts, as you said, I think it is important to know that many unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. have not committed any crime, and it is not a crime for most people to be in the U.S. without authorization. It is a civil offense, not a criminal offense. So that's sort of point one. And then point two is there's a lot of research done over decades by many different economists that show that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than US-born people, that the crime rate among the foreign-born population is much lower than the crime rate among the US-born population. There have been a lot of sensationalized news stories that I think are meant to fearmonger about immigrants committing crime. But that is just not, while there might be anecdotes, that is not borne out in the data. And so generalizing one or two people's criminal activity to an entire population, I think is really harmful. And I think we really need to be pushing back against that narrative because it's not borne out by the facts. And then the other thing I'll say about that is that while the previous presidential administrations did take a more targeted approach, and actually some of the early rhetoric in the Trump administration did claim they were going to take a more targeted approach that I think now is clear they're not. But even the past administrations that have tried to take a more targeted approach, in that those policies end up impacting lots of people who have no criminal convictions. So in the policy that I mentioned, secure communities, of course, that's only impacting people who have been arrested. So it should be a somewhat targeted program. But 20% of the people who were deported under secure communities were convicted of no crime. So there's still these kind of broader spillover effects onto people who haven't been convicted of a crime, even when we do try to target a program.
Yeah. Before I ask you one last question, I'd like to know what you think about public opinion. Clearly, the data that you mentioned and the studies that you've done and many others have done show the benefits of immigration to the United States. Perhaps we don't want undocumented immigration. I get it. I understand it. But we also are not opening visa paths, new visa paths for people to come in and work, even if temporarily. right? We definitely want to close that. There's a demographic change. You refer to that. There is a need for workers. The economy will need more and more and more workers. So we know the benefits of immigration, even the benefits of the undocumented immigrants that are already here working in our midst and contributing to our society at many different levels. Why the disconnect between the political rhetoric and the reality of who these people are, and why we may have to contemplate the idea that we need them and we may have to find a path for them to contribute? Perhaps, I don't know, maybe not a path to citizenship, but some kind of idea that, okay, these are valuable folks. They got families, they got US citizen children. We got to find a way. Why this disconnect? This is one of the more puzzling questions, and I can't find the answer.
Yes, I don't know that I have 100% of the answer, but I'll offer my thoughts from my experiences. I think this is a really hard question to answer, but I do think there's a couple of things going on. One is that I think we need to acknowledge the reality that a lot of US-born workers are not happy with their living conditions. They feel like the prices of things are too high, their wages are too low, and that is not something we should ignore. But we should also not let politicians use immigrants as scapegoats for those economic problems. That has been how politicians have used immigrants in their rhetoric for literal centuries in the US. We see again and again that whenever there's a recession, that the president blames immigrants for the recession. We know that that's not true. So I think we need to push back against that narrative while also acknowledging that other economic policies might be useful for benefiting people's lives. The other piece of it that I've been thinking about more as a researcher is the idea of what kinds of things change people's minds. So if they do have some embedded ideas about the contribution of immigrants or the harm that immigrants do, things like that, what can we do to convince people of the facts? And it seems that giving people sort of stories of immigrants' experience and immigrants' contribution is really impactful in a way that plain statistics are often not, which is unfortunate for me because I'm a quantitative researcher, but that does seem to be true in some of the research that I've seen. So that's something else that I'm thinking about as well when tackling this issue. Maybe one more quick thought, which is just if you look at the polling, it's actually very striking that people are not supportive of deporting families and parents with US citizen children and people who are not criminals. Really, the main support is for deporting people who have some kind of criminal history. And so I think making that distinction more clear for people and making clear that not all 11 million unauthorized people who are living in the US have a criminal history, as we were sort of talking about before, can also be sort of instructive for changing how people think about this issue.
So one last question from me. Here we are. The Trump administration is using the rhetoric. It's not connecting well. He's got a lot of support for what he's doing, although it seems that in the latest polls, he's losing some of that support. It's just too chaotic for most Americans at this point, that early in the administration, which is kind of amazing. But, this is going to go on. ICE is active. Raids in work sites are happening. People are being deported. And his intention is to drive through and go straight through with that plan. What can we look forward to if they continue to carry out these deportations, if the plan goes on, and even if by attrition they remove 3, 4, 5 million people out of our economy? What do you foresee? And you take out your crystal ball and say, here's the end of the Trump administration. Here's what the landscape is going to look like. What do you see?
I do expect to see, even if the number of people who are deported is not that high, which I think is possible given what we saw in the first Trump administration, where there was a lot of rhetoric but not a lot of action. I do think we should expect to see really harmful effects, both on the immigrant community, sort of as you referenced at the top, even people who they themselves are not deported, but we know that families will be separated. We know that kids will drop out of school. They won't show up for school because of fear of deportation. So all of these sort of broader community impacts. But then I think we should also expect to see harmful impacts on the economy, especially in the sectors that we talked about that are so reliant on immigrant workers. And I think we're already starting to see a little bit of that. I plan to do some work to try to track some of those harmful effects in real time. I think we will start to see that appearing just in the next few months based on the activity we've already seen, especially in places that have been really hard hit, like here in Denver.
The Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Leigh Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the Center. The episode was produced by Albi Delgado with support from Karina Zimo. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico to learn more. And thanks for listening.